Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Kaselniak. I'm with the Colorado Pilots Association, and I'm the chair of the safety committee. I'd like to welcome everybody tonight to our presentation. Tonight, we have Mr. Don Johnson from the National Museum of World War II Aviation, which is located in Colorado Springs. Mr. Johnson has been a docent at the museum since 2016, and he currently flies the museum's Fairchild PT 19B and the North American T6G Texan. Before joining the museum, Mr. Johnson was with Delta Airlines for 13 years, from 2007 to 2020. He flew the McDonnell Douglas MD-88, MD-90, and the Boeing 737. Prior to Delta, Don spent 20 years in the United States Air Force and retired as a lieutenant colonel. He flew the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy and the C-21, which is a Learjet 35. Tonight, Don will present a brief history of the museum, its current state and future plans, and an upcoming air show. So with that, I'd like to welcome Don to the CPA presentation tonight. Don, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you for accepting, and looking forward to hearing what you have to present tonight.
We'll have to unmute Don too.
Oh.
Okay, how about that?
That'll work. Cool.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me. Let me bring up my screen and the presentation that I have, and that way you guys can see what I'm talking about. No, okay. It's my presentation. Okay, I apologize if this is kind of clunky, but this is my first Zoom presentation. So, all right. So, like you said, this is I'm from the National Museum of World War II Aviation in Colorado Springs. First thing I want to point out is the word national in our title. That's not just a word that we picked. It's actually a legal designation that's been applied by Congress. There's only 13 nationally designated museums, so we're one of 13, and that happened in 2017. However, national doesn't mean that we get money from Congress. In fact, that was part of the deal when we achieved the designation, was we had to agree not to take money from Congress. So we're all a 501c3, it's all private donations. It's privately funded, and we're actually self-sustaining through museum admissions. So having been trained by the Air Force, I have to tell you what I'm going to talk about tonight, and then I'll talk about it, and then I can tell you what I said. So this is what we're going to start with. The beginning of the museum. I'll take you through what the museum is like today, where we're going in the future, and then I'll take you on sort of a virtual tour of the museum. It's sort of abbreviated, so you're still going to have to come down and pay the admission and take the full-blown tour. But I'll show you a little bit, just hopefully enough to whet your appetite. Okay, here's an aerial shot of the airport where we're located. We're actually right here on the northwest corner, just adjacent to 17 right and 35 left, and right across the street from runway 13. And then over here in the middle, you can see Peterson Air Force Base. You can tell that's an Air Force base because of the prominent feature there. It's got a golf course. So that's where we are. This is a closer shot of the museum. This is several years ago. So there were some things that have been added since then, but where we started was in 2004. Some guys had an idea to build a place to house their airplanes and kind of open it to the public and create sort of a mini museum, but it was just a static come in and take a look kind of thing. 2005, they built the first 3 hangars on the north side of the campus. It's about 45,000 square feet of display area, and that was its very humble beginnings. Now, they were friends with some folks out in California, a company called Westpac Restorations. And these guys out in California were losing their runway. They were at an airport that was being sold for development. And so they were looking for a place to relocate. And fortunately for us, they chose Colorado Springs. So 2008, they started to build a 65,000 square foot hangar on the northwest corner of the campus. And that's when they got the 501c3 status, so they could start raising money for the museum. And that's when things started to take off, of course. Now in 2009, that 65,000 square feet was completed, and Westpac moved out here to set up their operations. A couple years after that, they decided they would turn the museum into a flying museum. And so not just for static display, but we're going to start flying the airplanes now. In 2012 is when the museum opened to the public. And shortly after that, they added an education component to it. Education is really important to the mission of the museum. And so up until COVID kind of wrecked everything and put stuff on hold, we have a very robust STEM program for K through 12. In 2019, they added the first 40,000 square feet of what's eventually going to be an 80,000 square foot hangar. So this was considered phase one of the expansion program. And that is currently open right now. And later on during the tour, I'll take you through that pavilion and show you all the cool stuff we have in there. So here's where we are today. The campus is currently 21 acres. We've got 8 built out right now with another 13 to go. We're currently residing in 150,000 square feet of space. That includes the original 45,000 square feet in the hangars, plus the 65,000 at Westpac and the 40,000 square foot hangar we just completed in 2019. Plus we have an additional 80,000 square feet of ramp space, because being a flying museum, we got to be able to get to the runways. So we do have direct access to the 17 right run-up area. We currently have 20 World War II warbirds in the collection, all flyable. Plus another 7, which are from before and after the war, all in flying condition. We have 2 ongoing current restoration projects. Currently, one of those is kind of on hold because we're gearing up for our air show, and I'll talk more about the air show in September, but we have a lot of maintenance to get through, a lot of annuals. We have over 4,000 artifacts and documents, and almost all of those are on display. We have a massive, massive library of technical manuals. We've got maintenance manuals, and we've got a big microfiche library of drawings, all the blueprints and stuff for all the airplanes that we maintain. We have a big research library, and in addition, we also have a big collection of vehicles, which are all in running condition. This is the education program. Like I mentioned before, we have a very robust STEM program. However, just like everything else, COVID kind of wrecked that for now. We're currently working on getting that back up. But before COVID came along, we were able to get about 25,000 students through the program at a rate of about 3,600 per year. So we used to have a day every week where we were closed down just for the STEM program. And that was a lot of fun. We have an ongoing agreement or organization, or I don't know what to call it, a program that exists with the UCCS. We have engineering students over at the museum all the time, and they work on these neat technology programs. For example, one of them right now is they're modernizing a link trainer. So they're taking an old link trainer from World War II, and they're putting all modern electronics and computer graphics and things in that. They're making a couple of gun turrets that we have operable, and we're going to be able to use those for simulators. And they've created a simulator out of an old N3N biplane that we have. So you can sit in the biplane and fly around Colorado Springs. Yeah, that's a big attraction at the museum. We have an introduction to A&P for a high school student program. We're currently in the works. That's hopefully going to be up here in the near future, because one of the deals with becoming a national museum was that the city wanted us to open an A&P school. Again, that's something that's kind of been slowed down by the whole COVID thing, but it's certainly in the works. And in the near future, we should have a full-blown A&P school operating on the campus. For operations, currently we're open 5 days a week. We are looking at going to 7 days a week up here in the spring, because last summer we had a record-setting summer, which was really good for us because we almost didn't make it through COVID. So last summer we were setting record attendance, And of course, it slows down quite a bit when school opens up again. But during the holidays, it picks up and then slows back down again. So we're kind of slow right now, but coming up here pretty soon, we're going to 7 days a week. That means we're going to need a lot more volunteers because we are a fully volunteer-based organization. You can see there we currently have over 125 active volunteers, and we do everything from aircraft maintenance to docent tours like what I do, to flying operations, to everything else, collections, you name it. Everybody's a volunteer here. And the good news is that we are financially self-sustaining. The ticket sales do keep us open, they keep the lights on. And so we are able to keep going. And that's one of the requirements that we had to meet. So there's another slide that talks about the education programs. I wanted to keep that slide in there. It's a little redundant except for the last part there, which mentions our teacher flight program with Wings Over the Rockies. We do have something to do with that. And the big news is the Pikes Peak Regional Air Show, which is back on for this year. It used to be, the plan was to do it every 2 years. And of course we had to take a year off in the middle there for COVID. But things are going fast and furious right now to get ready for September. So that is what's coming up here next. These are the performers we currently have lined up for the air show. We've got the Air Combat Command F-35 plans to do a single ship demonstration plus a heritage flight with our P-38. Texas Raiders are going to bring their B-17. They're going to drop the Wings of Blue out of the Bombay for the national anthem. And then the Wings of Blue are going to do their full-blown demonstration as well, plus an Academy glider demonstration. Kyle Franklin's going to bring his Piper Cub and do his comedy routine. And all the airplanes in the museum, or virtually all the airplanes, are going to be flying. And so we're putting together a formation, legacy formation with the P-38 and our Brewster Corsair. I also should mention, I can't really tell you who's also thinking about coming, but we have at least 8 other acts that are possibly coming to the air show, including a BF-109, Spitfire, and a Hurricane, and probably another B-17. So quite a bit going on. Once again, I should plug that we do need lots of volunteers. It takes something like 800 to 1,000 volunteers to throw an air show. And so if that's something that might interest you guys, I'll give you a slide at the end that shows you how to volunteer to work at the museum or the air show. Okay. So what's coming up in the future? This is sort of the architect's concept of what the campus should look like over the next several years here. You can see up here on the north, this is the original museum, those original 3 hangars that I showed you. And then this is the 65,000 square foot Westpac hangar. And then over here, this half of our current hangar is currently up. And right now we're breaking ground on the second half of that. So that first 40,000 square feet was finished in 2019. And that brings us up to currently, oops, I went the wrong way, sorry. We're now on to the second half of the pavilion. That's going to equal 80,000 square feet when we're finished with it. We should be breaking ground here sometime in the next couple of months. And hopefully that's going to open up probably in the summer of next year. Phase 3 is going to be down here. That's the exhibit hall and education center. Remember, education is a huge part of our mission. So this education center is going to give us the classroom size that we need to continue with all of that. This is the architect's conception of what the exhibit hall is going to look like. So we're on the west side here looking east, and you notice it's going to have these big glass walls on the east and west side. So if you look out to the east, there's going to be an observation deck there inside the glass where it's air conditioned and heated, and you'll be able to see our airplanes flying by, because remember, we're right adjacent to runway 17 right, 35 left. And then if you look out to the west, you'll see Pikes Peak, a beautiful view that we have down here. This is the view of the inside of the exhibit hall as it would be set up for private events. That's also something that we do here. We currently rent out the pavilion for private events or a smaller hangar if you have a smaller event. And it's a big source of revenue for us. and we bring in quite a bit. The biggest crowd I think that we've had up to this point is over 700 people, and that was for a realtors get together. But Doug Lamborn uses our facility for his Academy nominations every year, and that's coming up pretty soon. So that's just an interesting source of revenue that we have. And so if anybody's in an organization that looks to rent facilities, we certainly have an interesting place. You can have your event surrounded by flying World War II airplanes. Okay, and so this is what it's going to take. Phase 1 was finished in 2019. That was at a total cost of about 7.2 million. Phase 2, which is where we are right now, trying to scrape together the last of 7.5 million. And you might be wondering how you can get away with building the same building for only 300,000 more when the cost of steel has more than doubled. And the only thing that I know about that is that I think they laid all the infrastructure when they built phase 1. So I think we're saving a lot of money having done that. Phase 3 should start or should end in 2028. We should have that up and running probably. That's going to cost about $36 million. And remember, we're 501c3, so all this money is coming from private donations and not a single penny from Congress. So let me take you on a virtual tour. This is the cool part. I'm going to show you some of our airplanes. Here we are inside the pavilion. This is the 40,000 square foot Kaya Raven Shook Aeronautical Pavilion. It's a funny name. Remember, the Udvar Hazy Center was named after the guy who spent all the money to make it. So this is the same thing here. The guy who put up more than half the money got to name it after his granddaughter. But anyway, I've walked through the World War I section. We don't have any airplanes in the World War I, but now we're standing here in the Between the Wars section. And the black and gold airplane that we're looking at is the world's only surviving Waco JYM from 1929. It's the only one. There was only 4 of them built. It was used for airmail. And so we use it to show the state of technology almost exactly halfway between the wars. You can tell it's made the exact same way that the World War I airplanes were made. It's got a fixed pitch propeller. It's all steel and wood construction with fabric covering. It's a biplane with fixed landing gear and all that external bracing. One of the neat things about this airplane, though, one of the things that makes it so incredibly rare is you might notice on the wall behind it, there's some pictures of Charles Lindberg. Charles Lindberg actually flew this airplane. We have his signature in the logbook. He did some promotional work for Northwest Airways, and so we got the logbook with Chuck Lindberg's signature. And unfortunately, because of that, that's one of the few airplanes in the collection that's actually flyable. So they tell me. Yeah, I've never seen it fly. We probably won't get to see that fly. It's just too rare. But you can tell from the oil pan underneath that it is a flyable airplane. It does still have oil in the engine. Right across from it here, this is our F3F. And this is a one of 4. Only 4 of these left in the world that still fly. And this is an interesting airplane. It's the last bi-wing fighter you would have found in US Navy service. After this, it was replaced with the F2A and the F4F. The Navy is going to go to all monowing fighter planes after this. But it was introduced in 1936 and is being replaced in 1941. And so if you know your history, it's pretty interesting to note that this old bi-wing fighter plane technology was being replaced only 3 years before the Germans were flying the first jet aircraft. So the Me-262 was flying just 3 years after this airplane was finally declared obsolete. Once again, it's a one of 4, a really rare airplane in our collection. I included this, being an airplane guy, I would call this a target. But we have a number of really, really nice models in our collection, really world-class stuff. Some things you might only see at the Smithsonian. This is a 1/72nd scale model of the USS Arizona. It's 6 feet long. It took the builder over 6 years to complete. He's a Polish man who lives in England. And as the story goes, I think his wife finally got tired of having this on her dining room table, so she told him to get rid of it, which was good for us. So he found us here in Colorado Springs because we had Don Stratton living here. Don was one of the oldest living survivors of the attack on the USS Arizona. He was actually at his battle station, which was in the port gun director, when the ship was sunk. And if you've seen the movies about Pearl Harbor, and you see that scene with those guys who were escaping over to the USS Vestal on a rope that was thrown over, that was one of those guys was Don Stratton. He was severely burned, but through perseverance, he actually survived and was able to get back into the Navy and served till the end of the war. His book, I think, is called All the Gallant Men, if you want to read about Don Stratton. He's a really interesting guy. This is White 33. She is, I would call her our flagship. She's the queen of our collection. There's only about 7 flying P-38s left in the world. This is the only flying P-38F model. You might know Glacier Girl, and she is supposedly an F model, but I think technically she is an E. I think what happened later in the build was they would build up to the next standard. And so Glacier Girl was probably built as an F, but she's technically an E. So that makes White 33 here the only F model in the world. But it's the only flying P-38 with kills to its credit. This airplane has 2 kills. It was being flown on December 31st, 1942 by a guy named Ken Sparks. And Ken shot down a Zero with this airplane. And then he was maneuvering against a second Zero. They ended up in a headlong pass. And they passed each other so close that when they did, their wingtips collided, and it knocked about 3 feet off of the right wingtip of this airplane. The Japanese fared a lot worse, though. He lost his entire wing and crashed into the jungle. So Ken and White 33 both got credited with 2 kills that day. This is an amazingly interesting airplane. It's got both of its turbochargers connected and operating. That makes it pretty rare as well. So you need to come down and check this thing out. Here's another incredibly rare airplane in our collection. This is our Spud, our SBD. Only 3 of these in flying condition in the world. There's a couple of A-24s that are painted like SBDs, but this is one of 3 actual SBDs that were built as SBDs. This one came out of Lake Michigan, which is where you find a lot of SBDs. That's where the Navy used to train their pilots to take off and land from aircraft carriers. And so this one was pulled up out of the bottom of the lake. And then the next step in the restoration process is, of course, you have to go to court because the Navy won't let you have their airplanes. So after a lengthy, expensive court battle, this airplane was finally restored. I think it was done at Vulture's Row. And it's probably one of the most historically accurate restorations you'll see of this aircraft. It actually even has its Yagi radar set in the back seat. So really neat airplane if you want to come down and see this one. We flew this one in June for our presentation about the Battle of Midway. So that's something we do here at the museum, is we have about 1 fly day every month in the summers when it's good flying weather. And it starts with a historic presentation. I actually did one of these presentations on training in World War II, and then we flew our T6 afterwards. So you definitely want to sign up at our website so you get our emails and our newsletters so that you know when things like that are going on. I definitely encourage you to do that. Okay, and here we are now on the west end of the pavilion looking east, just inside the hangar doors. We can see a bunch of airplanes here. I apologize for the terrible photography, but that's the best I could do with my camera. To the right there is L69. She is a Corsair, and she is the last remaining Brewster-built Corsair in the world. If you know the history behind the Brewster Corsairs, there's about 760 of them built. Most of those were sold to the English, who loved them, by the way, and they're the ones who figured out you could actually fly them from carriers and convince the Navy that they should give it a second chance. But all of the Brewster-built Corsairs that stayed in the US inventory were used for training. And so L69 here was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in North Carolina. And she was subsequently crashed by a student into a swamp where she remained for a number of decades. She was finally recovered out of the swamp, and again, have to go to court. So that after a lengthy and expensive court battle, This one was restored in Texas and just joined us here in our collection in about 2-3 years ago. Over to the left there is our B-25J. Maybe one of about 40 to 45 or so left in the world in flying condition. It's hard to keep track because they go in and out of flying status all the time. But anyway, about 40. This one is actually a movie star. If you've seen the movie Pearl Harbor, this is one of the B-25s that flew for that movie. In fact, it's the one that they used as Jimmy Doolittle's airplane. So this airplane has actually been on and or flown off of 5 different aircraft carriers in its time. The owner is the owner of Westpac Restorations, and he flies this airplane quite a bit at the museum here. It's one of our more prolific flyers. Right there in the center, you can see the backside of our P-47D. That one is kind of interesting because it's one of 3 in the world that actually has its turbocharger connected and operating. So that's something that normally you don't need. And so most owners disconnect those. They have a nasty tendency to catch fire every once in a while. So it's just not worth the risk, but our owners think it is. Okay, now we're across the ramp over in one of those 3 older hangars. This is what it looks like in the middle of hangar 2. You can see a bunch of our airplanes in this part of the hangar. In front of us is the T-34. In front of that is a Beech Super 18. Over to the left is our T-28. And then kind of hidden in the back to the right is a Stinson Reliant. That interesting airplane actually was flown by the Canadian Air Force during the war. And then later it was sold to an airline, a Canadian airline. And eventually it was bought by a guy named Frank Macon, who was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. So Frank and 4 partners owned that airplane until I think just about 2 years ago. Frank was 94 years old and he was done flying it, and he donated it to the museum because he wanted to make sure it would continue to fly. It currently needs some work. We're not flying it right now, but eventually the plans are to restore it, I believe, to repaint it in the Canadian colors and fly it in its former glory. And then another airplane that you can't see just behind the nose of the Super 18 there is an L-19 that we have. And that one is a really, really nice restoration. I'm sorry, you can't see it. Okay, this is our operating link trainer. We have 2 link trainers. One is being worked on right now by the college students, being upgraded to modern standards. This one is restored completely to its original condition, and it's actually fully functional. So we do demonstrations with this. It's really interesting because I don't know if you knew about Edwin Link, but his family, they made player pianos and organs. And so he used a number of technologies out of player pianos like this. Let me get my cursor up here. This motor up here in the front that turns the airplane about the vertical axis is actually, it's vacuum powered motor out of a player piano. So if you ever heard an old player piano, you hear a squeaking noise on the inside of the piano. That's this motor, which is designed to pull the paper over the sensors, and then it'll go back in the other direction. And that's this goes both ways. And then up here in the middle underneath, for pitch and bank, he used these old bellows out of same technology you find in an organ, like a church organ. So the whole thing's operated by vacuum pressure, and it spins around and it pitches and banks. And when you close the top here, you get inside, you're completely in the dark, and you got to fly by instruments. And if you think about where these things were based, down in the Southeast, where it was hot and probably not air conditioned, you can imagine locking yourself in this thing, getting all sweaty and hot and spinning around in circles. They used to have a lot of accidents. And so what you see in the case here, actually what's sticking up out of the data case is actually a barf bag. And that's original type equipment that they used to have in those things. Another interesting thing about this is the desk over here. This is the instructor's desk. This is one of the few restored links in the world that actually has an operating operator's or instructor's desk. And So you see this thing that goes over the top with this cord. It's connected to a plotter. I wish I'd gotten a picture of it, sorry, but you're gonna have to come in and see it firsthand. But the plotter on the desk actually moves in sync with the airplane. So as the student pilot is turning around and flying his airplane, the plotter is plotting his course on a map that's on the instructor's desk. And you can actually see the wheels moving on this thing when we do the demonstrations. Pretty interesting. This is our simulator. This is a project done by the UCCS students, and it's an N3N that's missing its skin. And it's been connected to modern flight simulator. And so it actually takes the inputs from the controls. And so you fly it just like the real airplane. This is a really popular attraction here at the museum. In fact, we charge $5 for 15 minutes. And this is Dom. He's one of our docent instructors talking the kid around Colorado Springs. And it's actually set to Colorado Springs. So you take off at the airport on the runway right outside the museum there and fly it around. This is part of our vehicle collection. We have a couple of M3 half tracks and an M2 Scout vehicle. This is our ubiquitous Chevy crash truck here, number 3 in line there from the right, or from the left, I'm sorry. And then we have a Ford-built Jeep down on the end. So I guess technically not a Willys, but the same thing. The interesting story about that was that Ford wanted to use his own engine. So Willys wanted to subcontract with Ford to build them. And Ford was so stubborn that he said he was going to put his own engines in them, but the Army refused to let that happen because they wanted standardization. So eventually they were able to talk Ford into using the Willys engine. So it's a Ford-built car with a Willys engine in it. Here's our Howard DGA on the left. It's a beautiful, beautiful restoration. In fact, I believe this one's an award winner at Oshkosh. And to the right there is the only civilian-owned Super Tweet left in the world. That's an OA-37 from the Vietnam conflict. I haven't seen that one fly yet either, but they tell me it is flyable. And I'd like to get into that someday. Okay, so now we've left the old part of the museum, the old hangars, and here we are at the Westback restoration facility. So I went up the top of the stairs, and this thing is so big, it's 65,000 square feet. I had to take a couple of pictures to get the whole thing in there, but you can see in the upper left there is an F4U, that is Jim Tobel's, and that airplane winters here at the museum. So he takes it out and flies the snot out of it during the airshow season in the summers and brings it back with all sorts of maintenance squawks and scrapes and, scratched up paint and stuff. And so we fix it for him every winter, and then we get to display it to everybody, which is really cool because we could park it next to the F3A, which is an early build Corsair, and this is a late build Corsair, and you can point out all the interesting features of this thing, like the taller tail wheel. And it's got the little stall fence out here outside of the right side guns. Right now, I think they got a cylinder off of this thing. I think he punched a hole in his cylinder during the airshow season, and so we're putting a new one on for him. Over here to the right, you can see one of our 2 Tiger Cats. We have 2 of, I think, 6 flyable Tiger Cats in the entire world. So we own 33% roughly of the flyable Tiger Cats left in the world. And more interesting than that is that they're sequential. One of them is 374 and the other one is 375. So they came off the production line right after one after the other. And they're both owned by the same collector whose initials happen to be JS. This is our PT-19. This is our flyable PT-19. And this is one of the 2 airplanes that I have the pleasure of flying here at the museum. It's just a joy. It's PT, of course, stands for primary trainer. So that's the first airplane you might have flown in Army pilot training in World War II. It's really docile, 175 horsepower or 200 horsepower on a good day, and sea level, of course. But here at 6,000 feet, we're probably not getting quite that much horsepower out of it. It's really a joy to fly. It takes off at about 60 knots. You fly it, or miles per hour. You fly it around the pattern about 80 miles per hour, and you fly it wide open. And you're lucky if you get to the perch with maybe 750 feet. You're not going to get to 1,000 feet. And we can only fly it when it's cold. But it would have been a great airplane to fly to get to know how to fly. It's got a really wide landing gear. So those of you with tailwheel experience, you can probably appreciate the wide, low center of gravity. It's really, really neat airplane. Over here to the right now, you can see the Tiger Cat in the upper left. So I've just turned the camera over here to see our one of our 2 TBMs. This one's going through its annual, getting ready to fly for the air show. We just took the prop off last weekend, and it's over here in the prop shop over to the right. I'll show you a picture of that in just a few minutes, but we got to take the props apart, clean them, inspect them, replace any worn parts, comply with any ADs. Things like, just like everything else on the airplane, it's really expensive and time consuming. Up at the top of the picture is our T6. That one was built in 42 as a T6C. And then, like most of the T6s that survived the war, it was surplus by D-Day or so. And so they put it in storage. And then within a few short years, when Korea kicked off, they needed pilots again. And so they pulled a bunch of these out and rebuilt them to the T6G standard, or Golf. And so that's what this one is. It was pulled out, and that explains the tail number here. You see it's got a 49 tail number. So it was built in 50 to the G standard and was used during the Korean conflict to train pilots. That's one of the other 2 that I get to fly here at the museum. It's probably one of the 5 nicest T6s in the country. All right, here's a view inside the prop shop. This is another unique thing. There's only about 3 shops like this in the US and very, very few in the world that can do the kind of work that they do. Over here on the left, you see the 3 blades that came out of the TBM. We'd just taken those out and cleaned them and put them in bags to keep the dirt off. Over here in the back, you can't really see it, but behind this, this prop is being built for a Corsair. And the one right behind it is the prop that's being built, or that was built, for our Curtiss Helldiver. I'll show you some pictures of that in a few more minutes, but it's a Curtiss Electric, really rare, really expensive. Like I said, this is one of the few shops in the world that can do this kind of work. And so they do work here for airplane owners around the world, including the Red Bull team in Austria. They have the contract to do the props for those guys. Really, really complex work. Of course, they don't make these parts anymore. So they use a bunch of original parts. One of the interesting things they can do, though, is if you want a new propeller blade and it doesn't exist out of the box, what they can do is they can take one of the larger blades with the same numbers, and they can actually reshape it to the smaller blades that you need for your warbird. So if you need a prop for your warbird, this is a place to go. This here is the machine shop, the metal bending shop. All of these are original World War II machinery. In fact, these Gargantuan hammer machines that you see right here, there's 2 of these. There's a 3rd one behind this one here, and there's actually 6 hammers. So there's 2 on each of these stands. Those are original to a machine factory in California. They were used before and during the war to make airplanes. And then after the war, they were repurposed to a number of things. One of the things they did was they were used by Carroll Shelby to make parts for some of his race cars. These hammers actually were used to build the first monorail for Disneyland. And they actually used them to build the first Batmobile for Hollywood, back when Batmobiles were actually made out of metal and not designed on computers. So these machines have almost as much history or story to them as some of the airplanes in our collection. This giant green bending brake here at the back of the shop is what you need if you're going to make P-38 wings, because they have a very big, complicated, tightly engineered internal structure. It's a corrugated aluminum structure that you need a really big bending brake to make. And so that machine there is one of the reasons this is one of the few places in the world they can make P-38 wings, although they don't want to do that anymore. That's why they just sold all their P-38 parts. And here's the beast. This is back in the restoration facility. That is an SB2C-1. Well, actually, if you back the story up a little bit, it was actually built as an A-25 Shrike for the US Army. The Army wanted some dive bombers. They're very impressed with the Germans' Stukas. And so they contracted with Curtiss for 1,500 of these Shrikes. And by the time they got 900 of them delivered, they decided to cancel the program for some reason, whether they decided that they just didn't like the airplane or just didn't need dive bombers. So they had 900 of these, and they called up the Department of the Navy and said, hey, do you want them? And the Navy said, no, thanks, not really. And so the Army was like, well, what are we going to do with them? The Navy said, well, you know what we do with an airplane we don't want to fly? We give it to the Marines. So that's what the Army did with their 900 Shrikes. They gave them to the Marine Corps. They redesignated them SB2C-1 under the Navy system. And so that's what this is. It ended up life as an SB2C-1 for the Marine Corps. When the Marines were done with it at the end of the war, it was no longer flyable. They turned it over to the fire department. It was a fire department trainer, and you know what they do with it. They light it on fire and practice putting it out, which is very bad for airplanes. And so when it was burned up to just a hulk, they dumped it in Lake Washington. And it was found there by some teenage divers, I think in the 80s. And they got together enough capital to pull it out of the lake, but they didn't have enough to restore it. So it was sold to another collector, and it started its restoration at another facility. The owner eventually got tired with those guys, and they weren't finished yet. So he pulled it out and brought it here. The cowling here, the lower engine cowling, you see on the left here behind the orange ladder, that piece has an interesting story. That's an original part, and it was found at a hangar in Arkansas. This guy had this thing sitting around and he didn't know what it was. And so he took a picture of it and sent it to the Smithsonian. And luckily there was a guy at the Smithsonian who had just left employment at Westpac Restorations, and he saw the picture and he said, hey, that's a lower engine cowling for an SB2C. And I bet you I know who might be interested in that. So if you call those guys out at Westpac in Colorado Springs, you might be able to work something out. So sure enough, he calls these guys up, and they said, heck yeah, we want that part. So they bought that, and that is saving them about 3 to 4 months worth of fabrication. And even further, when it got here, it was still painted its original colors. It was olive drab and neutral gray, which means it was built for one of those 900 Army A-25 Shrikes. So really cool airplane. Only one of these in flying condition right now. And so this is going to be number 2 or number 3, because there's another one being restored up in Minnesota right now. But when this one flies, it'll be the only flying -1 in existence. The other ones are -5s. So super cool stuff. This is our other restoration project right now. It's another PT-19, just like the one that we saw earlier. That's the fuselage and the engine. This is a 200 horsepower engine. Hopefully we're going to get something close to that out of it. This is the part that I work on Saturdays. This is the center wing section. And so there are 2 of us that are assigned to this. It's a volunteer project. So the volunteers are restoring the PT-19. The professionals are the ones working on the Helldiver. I get to work on this airplane on Saturdays. Shows you all the work that we've had to do. We had to de-skin it. And because they used animal hide glue back then, all the glue has failed. And so we had to go through and re-glue all the joints on the inside. We had to replace all of the broken parts and all the parts that had been replaced with not approved repair techniques. And we're using a modern epoxy to glue the whole thing together. And then we're reskinning it. This is an aircraft grade mahogany plywood. You notice the grain is diagonal to the sides. Makes it kind of expensive, but that's what's called out in the drawings. And so this is a really, really cool. It's been going on for months. It's kind of on hold right now because we're doing a lot of work to get ready for the air show. Which brings up my last point here. We need help. So if anybody is really interested in World War II airplanes or looking for something to do with all that spare time they got, we are all volunteer organization, and we need more volunteers, especially for the air show coming up. If you can only do a little bit of volunteer work, you don't want to make a long-term commitment. the air show might be for you. It's a good way to get in for free. And that's our address there at the bottom. So go to www.worldwar2aviation.org. Follow the links on how to get involved, and there's a volunteer form that you can send in. And if you're at all interested, I'd encourage you to do it. It's really rewarding. I love doing it. They ask for about 10 hours a week if you can spare that much time at the museum. But if you just want to do something for the air show, that's something you can do without being full-time. So that's what I had for you guys tonight. And so let me see if I can stop sharing. There's stop share. And I think we're back to my face. If you have any questions or comments, if you want to challenge me on anything, please feel free. If I gave you some wrong information, I'd love to get corrected.
This is Mike. I got one question for you.
Yes, sir.
That SB2C-1 that's in the restoration shop.
Yes, sir.
How long is it gonna take before that thing's, say, flyable? How many years do you think that's gonna be working on that?
The estimates, the happy estimates I get is that it's probably going to be on its wheels and with its engine running by the end of the year. So
Wow.
we may see it flying by next year.
That's fast.
Well, yeah, it's been in restoration for a long time. Like I said, the first shop had it for a number of years, and the owner finally couldn't take it anymore. So he pulled it out and brought it to Westpac, and I think they've had it now for about 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other question everybody always asks is, how much does that cost? And they don't tell me. So I can't answer that.
Right.
Yeah,
Now,
it's a lot.
Now, of the airplanes that you showed us some airplanes, and I'm looking on your website on all the planes.
Uh-huh.
How many of the aircraft are owned by the museum?
Of the 27, I think we own 17.
Okay.
Yeah, there's 10 that are privately owned still.
All right.
And I think, yeah, they're the really expensive ones. The Tiger Cats, the P-38.
And they're on loan by the owner to the museum for display purposes, education.
Yeah, the owners, and in the deal they get Westpac doing the maintenance, and they get a place to park them.
Okay.
And we get to see them and show them off.
Okay. I didn't see the Skyraider in your pictures. Was it in there?
No, it would have been just off to the right.
Okay.
I typically, when I do the tours, I typically leave the Skyraider out because, for one thing, you can't talk about everything in the collection.
Yeah.
But also, although the Skyraider was designed and first flew in 1945,
Right.
it's part of our legacy collection. So it's from the Korea Vietnam era.
Korea, right.
So I have to focus a little bit.
Okay. No, that's great. I was trying to get down there this week, but we had the snow come through, and I'm like, okay, I'm not even going to attempt it. But
Right.
yeah, within the next couple of weeks, I'm definitely making a trip down to your museum.
Yep, and we should be pulling the Skyraider out. I think it's one of the next couple of airplanes being pulled out for annual. So when you come to the museum, you can still see all those airplanes that are going through annuals. You just go through the Westpac tour, which is included with the price of admission.
Yeah. Last Saturday, we talked about a week ago, and you mentioned you were going to be flying the PT-19 on the 15th, I think it was.
Yeah, it was actually this weekend we were supposed to be flying, and the chief pilot, who lives in California, wasn't able to make it out because the airlines are so screwed up right now.
Okay.
He's not going to get stuck away from home. He's got a business, and he flies for business, and he usually includes us in his trips, but airlines are too messed up right now.
Okay.
So we didn't get to fly.
Oh,
Kind of
that's
bummed about that.
Yep. All right. Cool.
Hey, Don,
Yes, sir.
can you tell me a little bit about the two TBMs that you have? You have any history from where they came from?
I believe both came from Canada. where they were used as fire bombers. I know one for sure was a fire bomber, and I think they both were.
Forest Protection Limited.
Yes. Yeah, they
Okay.
were Canadian fire bombers. I think they had their turrets reinstalled before they came here. And so they both, in fact, the all dark blue airplane has a fully operating electric turret.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, they're pretty neat.
That's a hard thing to find.
Yes. Yeah, it's really hard to restore. We're working on another TBM turret right now at the museum in the restoration shop. I don't know how functional they're going to make that one, but they are restoring it right now.
And that'd be a nice museum piece just to have it sitting out there and have people go for a ride.
Yeah, it is. We have two turrets right now, a forward and aft turret from a Neptune. And that's one of the projects, or two of the projects that are being worked on by the engineering students. They're bringing those things back to life. And it's pretty interesting. If you come down and you see the tail turret, or no, I believe it's a nose turret from that thing. If you look on the side, you'll see a dent. And that was from one of their early attempts to power it up. And they found that they had to put a capacitor or something or a resistor in there to slow the motor down because it went all the way to the full stop and slammed into the side. So that's learning in progress.
Little dolly work, that'd come right out, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we could take it out, but it's an interesting thing to talk about. So, and we got lots of projects going on. So anyway, yeah, come down to see our TBMs. We just flew, one of our TBMs was the first flyer last summer. And I think we flew it in April or May or something like that. So they fly quite a bit too. Yeah, definitely sign up for our newsletter. That's how you know when we're going to fly.
And you sell rides any of those?
Not at the current time. As close as we've come is, well, for one thing, if you volunteer at the museum, we do volunteer appreciation days. So we just had a day where we flew the B-25, the PBY, and the T6 and gave all the volunteers rides. And then we had a day where we were going to fly the Corsair. And so we did the presentation, but the Corsair couldn't fly because, you know, the airplanes get a vote and sometimes they vote no. And so they flew the B-25 instead. And on that day, they took ticket holders from the audience and they drew tickets out and they took a number of people who'd bought admission to the event on a ride in the B-25.
Mm-hmm.
So that's as close as we are right now. But the FAA, of course, makes things really, really difficult, and every year it gets worse. And so for giving rides, it's getting harder and harder and more expensive. So the insurance, I think, is one of the holdups right now.
Okay, and besides getting the letter of authorization from the FAA, yeah.
Yeah, and then you have to have a whole program and everything.
Yeah.
So
I've been there.
yeah, it's something we'd like to do in the future. Right now we're working on building the second half of our hangar. And when we do get that finished, I forgot to mention, we're supposedly have a B-17 coming. We have a B-23, which is under restoration right now, and that's going to join the collection. Yeah, it's one of the ones that was owned by Howard Hughes.
I know that.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's pretty. We have the propellers right now because the propellers were done here at Westpac, and they're just waiting for the airframe to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
So all that stuff is coming. We're supposedly have a P-51 coming when we get the floor space for it too. So lots of exciting stuff.
Don, do you have a date for the air show in September?
I don't have the final date. I think right now the leading contender, I think, is the 24th and 25th, or that weekend right there. That's something you definitely want to watch the website for. As soon as they get that finalized. My understanding is that when you want to get military performers, you have to give them a primary and a secondary date. And so I think we had it narrowed down to 2 weekends, but I think it's coming soon. But definitely check the website for that.
Thank you.
My pleasure, of course.
Can you give me a little more background on Westpac? That's a term that I know as a Navy pilot. Who are the owners and how? Give me a little more history of Westpac.
The two owners are Bill Clares and Alan Wojak, and they came from California. So I don't know if I mentioned that in the presentation, but they were losing their airport. It's one of the airports that was sold to developers out there. And so it has nothing to do with Westpac, the airline, or like a Western Pacific tour or anything like that. So just because they were in California, that was where the name came from. And they've been here since 2009, I believe.
Well, that's a good thing that airport closed, but I hate to see any airport closed. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, and even if it wasn't, you know how onerous the tax situation is getting in California. They're much better off here. But they did have to get some legislative changes. It took some doing from the legislature here. They actually changed the tax rules because as it existed before, if you parked a $10 million airplane for any length of time in Colorado, they wanted you to pay taxes just to park it here. And so that's one of the changes they had to get made in order to stand up the museum and get the owners to park their airplanes here long term.
Yeah, that's a continuing problem, the taxation. And right now there's a piece of legislation going through the Colorado legislature for basically Part 135 people to give them a break, because otherwise you drive people out of the state. So
yeah,
keep working it.
Well, and it's, you know, you should learn from states like California and New York that are losing people for just these reasons. But I think that's Colorado is probably a little smarter, and they realize they can attract organizations like that if they're a little flexible.
Indeed. Thank you very much. That's an amazing museum.
Oh, thank you, sir. Yeah, it sure is. I love working there.
If you wanted to fly in for a visit, do you have parking on the ramp, or do you need to go to the FBO and shuttle over? How does that work?
It depends. If you call ahead and we're not using the ramp that day, we do have people that fly in to like some check pilots and things like that fly in and park just outside the fence. And so you can use the ramp there if it's just going to be for a couple hours or something like that. If you're going to stay overnight, I think they'd want you to park down at the FBO. But you may, and don't quote me on this, but you may be able to get in on our gas contract if you do that. So I don't know, definitely worth calling ahead to see what the arrangements are. I've never done it, but I do know that we have people fly in for the day and park right outside the fence.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Do you have a ground frequency for that?
No, no, we don't. We use the common ground frequency. You'd have to call on the phone before you take off. That's something you definitely want to have arranged beforehand. Yeah, we're not operating every single day, so we don't really have the need for any bandwidth. So when we fly, we're just, straight to ground.
When you get a plane that you're planning on building or rebuilding, recovering, I don't know.
Restoring.
Restoring, that's what
Yeah.
word I'm looking for. How much of the airplane has to be intact for it to be considered restorable?
Well, if all they have, if they have an incredibly rare, valuable airplane and all they have is a data plate, they can build the entire airplane around the data plate. Now, of course, they don't do castings or extrusions or anything like that. Any of the big metal parts that had to be built that way, they'll reuse parts from other airplanes. On the trip that they made out to New Guinea to dig up White 33 and the P-47s and the other P-38 parts that they bring back just a shipload of parts, and they put things together from other airplanes. And it's an interesting discussion that I've had with the owner of the company, Bill Clares. He says that they kind of catch flack from the Smithsonian because the Smithsonian says it has to be 50% original parts to be considered the original artifact. But Bill would argue, for one thing, they're a wax museum. They're not building them to fly. And second, he says, show me any airplane that went to combat, or even that flew for any number of years, that maintains 50% of its original parts. Even White 33 didn't go into the hole in the ground at the end of the war with its original wing, for example, because that was torn off by a Zero. So White 33 is probably somewhere around 40 to 60% original parts. But But when you're considering how many thousands of parts there are in a P-38, I guess it's probably not that many. It's an interesting question. You can see obviously on that that Helldiver, they started with just a little bit of the center fuselage and the center wing section, and everything else has been fabricated, or they're using parts from other projects.
Okay, yeah, because when you were talking about the plane that, you know, was put on fire and dumped in the lake and all that stuff, it's like, man, there can't be much of that left.
No, there's not, and that's why probably there's so few left. That and the fact that the Navy hated the airplane. But yeah, it's going to be really rare. It's going to be one of only 3 flying in the world. It's a treat to be around these things too. I just love going in a couple times a week and just touching these things and maintaining them and talking about them and, you know, sharing them with the public. Just a thrill.
So since it's a flying museum, I'm sure you're just desperate for pilots to fly them, right?
Yeah.
I guess what's the process if somebody wanted to do that or could do that?
Well, the short answer is there really is no process. So when Bill's kind of a curmudgeon, and when he's around and somebody asks that question, how do I get to fly these airplanes? He says, well, you buy one. And that is the best answer. I'm a beggar and can't be a chooser. So I'm one of the lucky, they need a few younger guys. And I've been there for, I was there 5 years before they let me touch the PT-19. And with, you know, over 11,000 hours of military and airline time, I'm still a know-nothing, you know, brand new to tail wheels and pistons and props and things like that. So the short answer is there is no process, but if somebody wanted to aspire to that, you would get your foot in the door and get Bill Clares to know who you are. You know, work your time at the museum as a volunteer, and then, you know, gently sometime in the future mention that you got a bunch of time and got the interest. So there's really not a shortage of pilots. There's just a shortage of people that they would trust with these
Right.
super expensive, you know, privately owned airplanes. So yeah, I'm lucky they've let me touch 2 of them so far. Yeah, but it's not out of the question. I would say the answer is volunteer and get to know these guys and make sure they get to know you.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can imagine. I mean, if I owned one of those things, I'd be really careful about who I let touch it. And they are.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But you know what? We work on them probably 200 hours for every 15 minutes of flying time, something like that. So I call it spa day. I go in on Saturdays and do aircraft maintenance and restoration, and get in up to my elbows in grease and turning wrenches and just learning how to care for these things. And that in and of itself too is rewarding as heck. And like I said, I tell my wife I'm going to spa day. It's, you know, it's a spa day for guys.
Right.
Get to maintain World War II airplanes and just be around them. Get to climb in them and on them and take them apart and put them back together and then watch them go fly and do their thing.
So my name is Dan Garner. I'm also from Colorado Springs. I'm an Academy grad, and let me just emphasize that, you know, when you talk about education of high school students, that's not very sexy, but the population that Don mentioned is some of our more disadvantaged populations here in Colorado Springs. So the outreach they do to these populations is high impact. It's really impactful. Very much appreciated by the citizens of Colorado Springs. And lastly, I know that you have to focus on World War II aviation, but I will also emphasize that Skyraider is an impressive airplane for anybody with Vietnam War era interests.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I can't disagree. And one of the interesting facts that we point out to people, and probably everybody in the audience knows this already, but that airplane could carry the same 8,000-pound bomb load as a B-17. And it's a single engine airplane. And that shows you how far the technology advanced in those few short years. And it is impressive as heck. And we are going to fly it at the air show. And it's a huge, huge draw. It's just, it's one of those things where you got to pick and choose what you can talk about. So. But yeah, so if you've been here and you live in the Springs, you've been to the museum, obviously. Okay, good. Yeah, we do, if you have time to give, do need lots of volunteers, and the program, the STEM program is supposed to be coming back, and it's very, very important to the museum. Like I said, the plans are for a full-blown A&P school in the near future. Because you've probably heard about the pilot shortage, but you might not have also heard there's a big shortage of maintainers out there. Everyone that works in aviation is very short right now. And so there's a huge need for people who are trained how to do this in the future. So that's coming back, and eventually we'll have the facilities to have a full-blown school like that up and running.
Okay.
But
Are
thanks, Dan.
you guys going to handle turbine engine requirements too for A&P?
Absolutely. At the school, they will definitely. It's probably going to be heavily turbine and very, very low piston time for those guys. But they do have a shortage of people who know how to maintain airplanes. So the guys with A&Ps, the guys and girls with A&Ps, that's one of the attractions to the museum of having the school there, is to have their pick of the crop, so to speak, and try to get these guys interested early on, the students when they're young. So, but it should be interesting.
Is Emily Griffith still operating?
I don't know the name.
As far as Emily Griffith, well, it was Emily Griffith Opportunity School, and it used to be based out of Stapleton, but when Stapleton moved, they were going to go someplace else. It was an A&P school.
I haven't heard it. I can't remember the name of the school that they were working with, but before COVID, they had a school in mind and they were very close, but
Sparta?
yeah,
Sparta?
that was it.
One
That
of the
was
big
it.
ones.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what's going to happen now that they're restarting all these plans, but we'll see what happens. It's definitely still in the plans, and it was part of the requirement for the national designation.
Mm-hmm. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. And Don, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I hope to get down at the museum and say hi to you. Bring some of my grandkids down and have a tour of the facility. I really appreciate this. This was a fantastic opportunity. I never knew you guys were there. I was down in Colorado Springs a couple weeks ago with my daughter and granddaughter, and they said, "What do you want to do, Grandpa?" And I said, "Well, let's look at the museums around here." And your museum came up, but unfortunately we didn't have time. We're on a schedule. And
Okay.
I said, we're definitely got to get back down there.
Well,
But,
it's bigger than people think. So make sure you give yourself like at least half a day,
Definitely,
or as much as the kids can take anyway.
definitely. So on behalf of the Colorado Pilots Association, Don, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.